Explain for us, please, where the cameras were positioned and how we obtained these videos?
Yes, so the trailer on the, I guess, the bottom right side of that photograph with the 3 blue arrows pointing from it would depict the direction of each camera at that trailer belonging to Mark Clark.
And while we're publishing exhibits, I'd ask for the court's permission to publish exhibit number 38A that has been received into evidence.
You may do so.
Thank you. During the course of the investigation, Lieutenant Buda, did it come to your attention that Drew Wagner had rented a ground warmer from Star Equipment?
Yes.
And how did that come to your attention?
Through an interview, through the proffer interview with Paul Hoff, and then also from a phone call from Dan Castle.
And after you received that information, did that prompt the investigators working on this case then to obtain this receipt that we see here marked as 38A from Star Equipment?
Yes.
Okay. And it appears that Eric Lamb actually had rented this equipment,
Yes.
Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and this was something that Drew Wagner referred to when he was interviewed?
Yes.
Okay. And I want to direct your attention now, sir, to what has not been received in evidence, exhibit number 83, if you could leaf through the 3-wing binder.
Okay.
And what is, you recognize exhibit number 83?
Yes.
And what is number 83?
It's a receipt from Springville Ready Mix dated 12/14 of 2018.
December 14th of 18?
Yes.
Okay. And why did you obtain that receipt?
Just to find out or to verify that that they had been working on Beaver Avenue on the 14th and kind of when the load time was, and just to verify facts.
Okay. And is number 83 a fair and accurate copy of the receipt that you obtained from the cement company involved?
Yes.
State would offer to evidence, Your Honor, exhibit number 83.
Any objection, Mr. Speaks? Exhibit 3 is admitted. Sorry, 83, not 3.
And permission to post this for the jury, Your
You
Honor?
may do so.
And now I direct your attention to the display screens here and ask if this is the receipt you received from Springville Ready Mix showing that a delivery of concrete was made to a job site on Beaver Avenue.
Yes.
Okay. And is this the job site that was referred to by Dan Castle then?
Yes.
Finally, sir, during the course of this investigation, was there a time when investigators served search warrants on properties related to Andy Shaw?
Yes, there was.
And tell us about that.
Through cooperation with the DEA and to further investigate the circumstance around Chris's death, they worked on search warrants and stuff for at least 3 or 4 addresses in Cedar Rapids.
All belonging to Andy Shaw?
Yes.
And what was uncovered and seized during the execution of those search warrants at Andy Shaw's properties in general?
In general, firearms, marijuana paraphernalia. There was gummy bear forms or whatever to make the THC gummies that they sell and stuff now. There was gelatin. There was actually a mixture of gelatin already made with THC in it. Large amount of cash, just items, drug items such as that.
And when you say a large amount of cash, how much cash are we talking about?
On the properties on Capitol Drive, we recovered $19,000 and some odd dollars. And then additionally, at his residence, they seized $39,000 in cash.
And the exhibits that we referred to earlier, the ones both on Cedar and the trailer court itself on Mount Vernon Road, are all those locations within the confines of Lynn County, Iowa?
Yes, they are.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Steves, you may start your cross-exam.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Lieutenant, yesterday you told us about the cooperation agreements that are often used by law enforcement, prosecuting authorities to recruit the cooperation of people who have either pending criminal charges or pending criminal investigations in their lives. Remember that?
Yes.
And you told us that one of the conditions of a cooperation agreement is that the person who's the subject of that agreement give truthful testimony. Remember that?
Yes.
And I'd like you to take a look at Defendant's Exhibit A in the black defense exhibit folder, please. And with the court's permission, I'd like to show the jury that exhibit again.
You may do so.
What you have there in your folder and what the men and women of the jury have in front of them is a portion of Defendant's Exhibit A, which is the plea agreement between the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Iowa and one of the witnesses who testified earlier in this case. And I'd like you to take a look at paragraph 22 of Defendant's Exhibit A. And Lieutenant, I know that you, in your law enforcement experience, have worked, as you mentioned earlier, with the Drug Enforcement Administration, the FBI, other federal law enforcement agencies, right?
Yes.
And you know that what we're seeing on the screen now talks about the potential that a prosecutor can use to give a cooperating individual an inducement or an incentive for cooperating, right?
Yes.
That, as you testified yesterday, if a person cooperates and their testimony is found to be of substantial assistance to the prosecution or to law enforcement, a United States attorney can then ask a court to depart downward and give a lesser sentence. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's accurate.
And the only way that a person can get that kind of a reduction based on cooperation is if the prosecution asks the court to give a reduced sentence.
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay, and so what we show here in paragraph 22 is the United States saying that they will make this request for a reduced sentence if there is substantial assistance from the cooperating individual, right?
Yes.
Okay, so now let's take a look at paragraph 25 of Defendant's Exhibit A. And paragraph 25 talks about how the United States takes into account whether or not the cooperation is substantial or not. And you're familiar with these provisions in a plea agreement, aren't you, sir?
I'll be honest, I've never read through a plea agreement like this before. That's generally taken care of between attorneys.
I'm sorry?
I've never read through plea agreements such as these. That's usually taken care of between the attorneys.
Okay, so this has been offered into evidence and it's been received by the court, and this is the plea agreement that was reached in this case. And paragraph 25 says that the evaluation of whether or not this cooperation is substantial will be based on the government's evaluation of the significance and the government's evaluation of the truthfulness. So would it be accurate, sir, to do that, to say that the United States attorney or the United States prosecutor makes the decision about whether the cooperation is useful, whether or not it's truthful?
Well, I think they are are part of that, yeah, but I also think the defense attorney would argue during sentencing on some of that also.
Well, the fact of the matter is, it's up to the United States Attorney to make that decision, sir.
Okay, that's beyond the scope that I usually deal with, so I
Okay.
can't answer that.
So we'll take that down. And what I want to ask you next, sir, is that you just described the search of the Andy Shaw property. In your investigation in this case, there was also a search done of the Chris Bagley property in Marion, wasn't there?
By the Marion Police Department?
Yes,
Yes,
right. And you became familiar with that in the course of your work in this case.
I did.
And when Chris Bagley's apartment was searched, that was in September of 2018?
That sounds accurate.
And do you recall that this search was at 2595 Fifth Avenue in Marion?
Yes,
During the search of Mr. Bagley's apartment, there was a firearm located, wasn't there?
yes,
And in addition to a firearm, there were also loaded magazines with loaded bullets in them?
possible.
Well, would looking at the report of the search findings help you remember that?
Sure.
May I approach, Sean?
You may.
Okay.
And were there loaded magazines found there in the search?
A magazine with 4 rounds is what it states.
Right. And do you recall, Lieutenant, in addition to firearms or a firearm and loaded ammunition, were there also spent shell casings found there? If you remember.
I don't remember.
Remember seeing pictures of spent shell casings at Mr. Bagley's house?
I don't remember those. There could be, I don't know.
Okay. Can you tell me why somebody would keep spent shell casings?
I can't give you an answer for that, unless they reload or something.
Well, that's not very common to reload handgun ammunition, is it?
I don't know why they would keep those, no.
Well, might a robber want to pick up spent shell casings so that he doesn't leave shell casings behind?
Sure.
In addition, Lieutenant, were any guns that were linked to Chris Bagley tested for the presence of blood?
Not that I'm aware of.
We do know, I think as you testified earlier, that there was a FBI examination or a DCI examination of some knives that were retrieved in this investigation.
The knives were analyzed or examined by the FBI lab.
Okay. Knives linked to Mr. Blahnik?
Yes.
And was there anything of forensic or scientific significance extracted during the course of that testing?
The only one of the knives had was positive for blood, and the blood found was belonging to Mr. Blahnik.
And nothing linking it to Mr. Bagley?
Correct.
And also, do you know, sir, that the sheaths from the knives that were found at Mr. Blahnik's home and in his car were also examined for the presence of any link to Mr. Bagley?
They were.
And they were analyzed at the FBI laboratory?
Those were analyzed through the Iowa DCI lab.
Okay. And the Iowa DCI testing revealed what, sir?
No traces of DNA belonging to Chris Bagley.
Finally, do you know whether or not there was a tracking device put on Chris Bagley's car or truck?
I do not know that.
Well, wasn't there a search warrant obtained here in Lynn County for the installation of a tracking device on a black 2011 Ford Super Duty F-350, licensed to Mr. Bagley?
Not by the sheriff's office that I'm aware of.
In your investigation of this case, Lieutenant, did you measure the length of the knives that were seized from Mr. Blahnik?
I did not measure them myself. I know through images the length of the knives were depicted in that.
Yeah. So when the men and women of the jury take a look at those photographs, they're going to be able to see the length of the blade on the knives?
Correct.
Okay. Did you ever find any cell phone or text message records between Mr. Blahnik and Andy Shaw?
I did not.
Or between him and Lydia Oline or Kaylee Anderson?
No, not for the period that we requested records.
Thank you. Those are all the questions I have for you.
Mr. Anderson, do you have any direct?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
Detective or Lieutenant, you may step down. Is the state ready to call the next witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may do so.
State calls Dr. Kelly Cruz to the stand.
And counsel, just let me know when we reach that point during Dr. Cruz's testimony, please.
Yes, Judge. Can I have these flipped to...
Why would you give me Just kidding.
Dear doctor, before you sit down, please raise your right hand for me. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this trial will be true, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
You can take your seat. Please state and spell your name for the record.
My name is Kelly Cruz, Kelley, Kruse.
Your witness, Ms. Slaughter.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Cruz.
Good afternoon.
Dr. Cruz, can you tell us, start by telling us where you're currently employed?
I am employed at the Iowa office of the state medical examiner, and I am an associate state medical examiner there.
Dr. Cruz, can you tell us a little bit about your educational background that qualifies you to hold the position of an associate state medical examiner?
I graduated from high school in 2004. From 2004 to 2008, I attended undergraduate school at Tulane University. I earned a Bachelor of Science in Anthropology there. Then from 2008 to 2009, I attended St. George's University, and I earned my Master's of Public Health. Then I stayed at St. George's from 2009 to 2013 and attended medical school. After I graduated from medical school in 2013, I attended a pathology residency program in New Jersey, and I graduated from that program in 2017. And then from 2017 to 2018, I attended a forensic pathology fellowship program at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner of Maryland.
Doctor, can you help us first with the word pathology? You've used that a couple times. What's pathology?
Pathology is a subset of medicine that really looks at disease specifically and how that disease affects the human body.
And so, what is the difference between the anatomic and clinical pathology and the forensic pathology that you did different programs for during your educational background?
There are a lot of different facets to pathology. You can look at pathology as sort of clinical medicine in the hospital and then forensic pathology. In the clinical hospital pathology programs that you have really at every hospital, there's anatomic pathology and clinical pathology. So anatomic pathology involves specimens from the operating room. Say you have appendicitis, they take your appendix out. Pathologists will look at that appendix and say it was inflamed or maybe you have cancer. In terms of clinical pathology, they deal with parts of medicine like blood banking, so blood transfusions, transfusion reactions, molecular biology. They look at virology, parasitology, kind of a group of all different facets of medicine, a lot of lab work. In contrast to that, forensic pathology, as forensic pathologists, we look at disease, but we also look at injury and how injury affects the human body. And specifically, we do autopsies to determine the cause and the manner of death.
Doctor, the Iowa Office of State Medical Examiners, if I refer to that as the medical examiner's office, is this the same thing?
Yes.
Okay. Where's that located?
In Ankeny, Iowa.
And as an associate medical examiner, can you describe for us or tell us what your primary job responsibilities are?
As I stated, forensic pathologists or medical examiners, we perform autopsies. So a large part of my job is performing an autopsy, looking at the human body in an effort to determine cause and manner of death. Once I have determined the cause and the manner, I sign death certificates, I talk to family members, I talk to law enforcement, I provide expert testimony if one of my cases goes to trial. I also provide education for medical students and lectures throughout Iowa for people in medicine and also just people interested in the forensic pathology field.
Dr. Cruz, when you perform autopsies, is there a standard or an industry standard for the process, the procedure, and how you complete those?
Yes.
And can you explain to us what those protocols or what those procedures are?
Most autopsies are performed the same way. There are little nuances based on the medical examiner, but for the most part, an autopsy can be split into the external examination and the internal examination. In the external examination, we look at the external surface of the body. We look at clothing a person is wearing. If they have medical therapy, we look for any sort of injury, any indication of natural disease or say a cancer or a tumor. We also document how a person looks. So what color their hair is, their color of their eyes, if they have scars, tattoos, etc. Once we've completed that external examination, which also part of that is weighing and measuring the body, we perform, it's a surgical Y-shaped incision, and that opens up the skin and will remove the chest plate, and then we look at the internal organs for the internal examination. We then take out each organ, we weigh it, and then we look at each organ for any sort of natural disease or any sort of injury. As part of that internal examination process, we also collect specimens. So we will collect fluid from the eyes, we'll collect blood, and we'll also collect urine if it's available. And we will send those specimens, if appropriate, for toxicology testing or maybe any other sort of testing, say cultures, if we think they have a bacterial infection. Once all of that internal examination process is completed, we've looked at everything we want to, we will then return the organs to the body. We'll sew the body back up, and the body is released to the funeral home for final disposition.
Dr. Cruz, in your career, do you know approximately how many autopsies you've completed?
To date, I performed 1,077 autopsies.
When autopsies are they performed just by you or with a team, or how does that work?
It has varied throughout my career. For the most part, in how we perform autopsies at the state medical examiner, the pathologist, is in the autopsy suite, and I work with an autopsy technician, and they help removing the organs, weighing the organs, moving the body, weighing the body. They also return the organs to the body and sew it back up so it can be released to the funeral home.
Dr. Cruz, there is a white 3-ring binder up there somewhere. There it is, yep. Nope, that's the black one. Thank you. Will you flip to the back of that and look at what's been marked as State's Exhibit 114? It's a 3-page document.
Yes.
Do you recognize that?
Yes.
And what is that?
It's my CV.
And what's a CV?
It describes my education, my professional accomplishments, lectures, research, other things I've done in my professional career.
And from looking at State's Exhibit 114, is that document up to date?
Yes.
Your Honor, State moves to have Exhibit 114 admitted into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection, thank you.
Exhibit 114 is admitted.
Dr. Cruz, were you assigned to perform an autopsy on the body of Christopher Bagley?
Yes.
And can you tell us how you came to be involved, how you initially became involved in that case?
At our office, at the time, we had 4 pathologists. We're on a rotating schedule. So when it was time to perform the autopsy on Mr. Bagley, it was in essence my turn. However, prior to the autopsy, our office was notified, not me directly, but our office in general, that there was going to be a body excavation in Cedar Rapids. There was some discussion among the pathologists because there was a request to have one of us attend. Was newer in my career and kind of jumped at the chance, in essence, to go and assist in that case.
Do you recall who you were contacted by from Cedar Rapids, Lynn County area?
I do remember having a conversation with DCI agent Trent Valletta, and then I can't remember exactly who I spoke to other than that prior to coming to Cedar Rapids.
When you get called into a situation like this, are you provided some, initial information? Did Trent give you information about what to expect or what they were needing from you?
Yes, he did.
And what was that information?
He wanted my expertise in excavating a body. There was a body believed to be buried in the ground, and the ground was frozen. So he wanted me to provide any assistance in that process. As we discussed the case, I thought it would be necessary to ask the assistance also of our forensic anthropologist, who is well-versed in body excavation. It's Dr. Heather Garvin. So I asked, Heather Garvin. So I asked her to come as well.
And so when you say come, did the two of you come to Cedar Rapids?
We did, along with Kathy Madison. She's an investigator at our office.
And when you got to Cedar Rapids, Dr. Cruz, do you guys go straight to the location? What happens when you get here?
We arrived and we went to the Lynn County Sheriff's Office, I believe, and had a meeting about where we would be headed for the body excavation.
Are there protocols in place for excavation or exhumation?
It depends on who you ask. There are different protocols with different agencies, like the FBI, who was at the scene to provide assistance. In general, there's no really clear handbook. That's why they asked my assistance, and I asked for Dr. Garvin's assistance. Really, all hands on deck was necessary to do the best job.
And when you say the best job, what are you guys trying to accomplish other than just getting a body out of the ground?
Our first goal was locating the body. At that time, law enforcement had indicated they weren't sure exactly where the body was, and that's one of the reasons why I asked Dr. Garvin to come. As an anthropologist, she's experienced in looking at ground and soil and seeing if peat has been disturbed and to indicate potentially if there's a grave somewhere. Also, really where my expertise came in during the process of removing the body from the ground, doing our best not to cause any sort of artifact that may potentially look like injury during the autopsy later on.
And when you say an artifact that could potentially look like an injury, if this body during the exhumation or excavation would have been damaged or injured additionally, do you note that? What do you do with that information?
I wanted to really have eyes on the body at all times because it can be difficult to determine if what we see on a body is a true injury or what we term an artifact, meaning a disturbance or a defect in the body that actually isn't an injury that hurt the person while they were alive, especially if somebody has been dead for a long period of time. So it really is a difficult process to determine between the two. So simply looking at the body, seeing if there was contact made between some sort of tool that was used in removing the body from the ground was really important for me.
And Doctor, while you were watching and were involved in this process, did you note or did you see any artifacts that were caused?
There was some contact between the body and tools, but it actually was difficult to tell if that contact truly created a defect due to the positioning of the body. It was pretty deep in the ground. It was covered with a sheet. But I did make note of the times when there were contact for when I performed the autopsy later.
And to your recollection, Doctor, can you recall how long it took to excavate the body?
It was a 2-day process.
And why was it a 2-day process?
The ground was frozen, so really first, as I had said, there was the attempt to locate the body. That took a lot of the first day, and once the body was located, the ground was frozen. So attempts were made to warm or heat the ground so that the body could be removed or dug up.
And so the actual digging that took place, was all of the digging done on the second day, or was there?
I can't remember if absolutely all of it, but the majority of the digging was done the second day.
Dr. Cruz, at some point, were you, before you came to Cedar Rapids, or at what point did you know whose body you were looking for?
It was with my first conversation with Detective Valletta, and I believe I had been told in the office earlier in the week because I also had seen news reports of a missing person.
Is part of your responsibility or part of your duties, is that to confirm identity?
Yes.
And were you able to confirm that the body that you removed from the ground was Christopher Bagley?
Yes.
Can you tell us how you make that identification?
There are a few different methods we can use in the identification process, Most commonly in our office, we use visual identification. People die in the presence of their family members. They look like their driver's license. In this case, Mr. Bagley did look like his driver's license because he was well preserved despite the amount of time that had gone by. But I wanted to go further to confirm identification just with other tools that we had in the office. We also procured dental records, so I had radiographs of his teeth, and we took x-rays or radiographs in our office, and I compared those two. Mr. Bagley also had a tattoo of his last name on his chest, so I used that also as what we call circumstantial identification.
Dr. Cruz, can you tell us, once Chris's body was removed from the ground, what happens next?
Once the body was removed from the ground, it was photographed, placed into a body bag, and that bag was sealed and labeled, and then it was transported to our medical examiner's office in Ankeny.
Who did the sealing and the labeling?
I actually did the sealing and the labeling of the body on the outside of the bag. I also labeled the body itself. And then the transportation process was done by an ambulance company in Lynn County.
And when you say sealed, does that mean the bag can't be opened?
The bag can be, but it's a sort of lock. It's not foolproof. It's easy to actually open, but we would know at the medical examiner's office if someone broke that lock.
And did you see any signs of that type of tampering with the bag?
No, I did not.
Dr. Cruz, when Christopher Bagley's body arrived at the medical examiner's office, does it go straight to autopsy? Tell us what happens when the body arrives there.
When a body arrives at our office, it's usually placed in a cooler first. We perform autopsies in the morning, so if a body arrives after we have started autopsies, it usually waits for at least the next day. Depending on the number of cases that we have, it may need to wait longer. Because Mr. Bagley's body was in frozen ground, he himself was frozen, so we took a period of time, it was essentially over the weekend, to thaw his body out so an autopsy could be performed.
Were there concerns during this thawing process of decomposition?
Yes.
And what, if anything, did you guys do, or did you do, doctor, to combat those concerns?
We don't just leave the body out in a warm environment. The body is placed in a cooler that's usually around 37 degrees. So we will put the body in the cooler, take it out for a fairly short amount of time, put it back in the cooler, and have a sort of rotational process like that over time in an effort to combat decomposition. Some may happen, but it significantly reduces it.
Dr. Cruz, can you walk us through essentially the autopsy of Christopher Bagley, from the moment you have made a determination that, you know, he's thawed and it's ready to go?
So when it was time to perform his autopsy, we removed his body from the cooler. At that point, we weighed his body and we measured his length. And then we conducted the external examination and tried to follow the same process we really do with everyone. As part of what we call a homicide workup, we take a few extra steps, such as collecting fingernails. We will take a blood stain card, which having one is part of our normal process, but we'll take an extra one for law enforcement that can be used for DNA. We will also take pulled head hair for DNA purposes as well. We also removed the clothing, carefully photographed it, which is something we don't normally do, documented it. We preserved the clothing for law enforcement, and then I began my external examination, documenting what he looked like, what his tattoos looked like, and what sort of injuries he had.
Doctor, you stated that as part of that you weighed and measured the body. How tall was Mr. Bagley?
Consult my autopsy report. if that's
Yes.
okay. So he measured 69.5 inches in length.
And how tall is that in feet?
It's 5'9.5".
Okay, thank you. You also, in discussing the process, you mentioned that you take fingernail clippings?
Yes.
And can you tell us what you do with fingernail clippings?
We'll take the fingernail clippings, so we use an actual fingernail clipper and cut off the tip of the fingernail and carefully rip off the rest of it. We put it in a manila envelope, seal it, and then we give it to law enforcement, and they can submit it for DNA testing or whatever else they want to do with it.
So a way of preserving what's under the fingernails?
Correct.
You also mentioned that you photographed clothing,
Yes,
and if I heard you correctly, you said you don't typically do that.
correct.
Can you tell us why you did in this case?
In this case, Mr. Bagley had a number of what I call defects or holes in his clothing that correlated with the stab wounds that I saw on his body.
And when you go through this examination or this autopsy, tell us how you're documenting different steps in this process.
I have a body diagram, and I go from head to toe, documenting what I document for everybody: his hair color, his eye color, how his teeth look, tattoos, scars. Then also using that body diagram, I will draw on it if there's any sort of injury. So in his case, I had a number of figures within my diagram that noted that he had stab wounds.
Do you also photograph?
We do.
And so not just the clothes are photographed, but the body itself.
Correct.
And doctor, do you do a full body shot?
Yes.
And when the body comes in, do you photograph it as is,
Yes.
with clothing and everything?
Yes.
And then is there a series of photographs that are taken without clothes but before a washing?
Yes.
And then is the body washed?
Yes.
And do you take photos from there,
Yes.
noting whatever you find?
Exactly. Anything that we deem of importance at that time.
Dr. Cruz, I'm going to send you back in our binder. If you could look at what have been marked as exhibits 84 through 98, and I believe those are bound just to get there quicker.
Yes.
You said yes, you found them?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Do you recognize these photographs?
Yes.
And what are they photographs of?
They're photographs taken at the autopsy.
Fair and accurate depictions of what you saw and your findings during that autopsy?
Yes.
Your Honor, state would offer exhibits 84 through 98.
Mr. Sneed,
There is no objection, Your Honor.
exhibits 84 through 98 are admitted.
And Dr. Cruz, there should be a laser pointer up there. I'm going to, if possible, put these up onto the screen, and then if you can help walk us through what your findings are. Your Honor, permission to publish these exhibits?
Permission granted.
And Dr. Cruz, before I pull these up, would it be fair to say that these photographs are graphic?
Yes.
Okay. Starting first with State's Exhibit 84, do you recognize what you see in this photo, doctor?
Yes.
And can you tell us what this is?
This is that lock that we spoke of earlier where I would know if someone broke it and went into the body bag. It has a number on it and also a tag indicating who is in the body bag, their date of birth, when they were found, where they were found, and who tagged the body, which is myself.
And moving on to Exhibit 85, do you recognize this photo?
Yes,
Where was this photo taken?
at the state medical examiner's office.
And was this a photograph that you took right away upon opening that bag?
Yes.
Can you tell us, doctor, why there's a ruler in this photograph?
You will notice in each photograph taken at autopsy, there is a ruler, and on that ruler is our state autopsy number.
Does each autopsy that you perform have a different number on the ruler?
Yes.
Moving on to Exhibit 86, can you tell us, Dr. Cruz, what we're seeing in this photograph?
This is a photograph of Mr. Bagley as he was received with that tarp that was initially over him, opened. Nothing else was done to his body before we took that photograph.
Is it typical during autopsies that as you are unwrapping that you're taking photographs of each stage?
It depends. In a case like this, yes.
Moving on to State's Exhibit 87, can you tell us, doctor, what we're seeing in this photograph?
This is a photograph of Mr. Bagley's face. We call this an identification photograph. Here he's clean, and it's just a head-on shot of his face, again with our ruler, with our medical examiner's office number.
And when you say he's clean, do you literally mean you have washed this body?
Yes, we have sinks in the autopsy suite, and we use water and soap at times to clean the bodies.
And doctor, when you referenced the earlier that there was a tattoo of Mr. Bagley's name.
Yes.
Is that the tattoo that's visible in this photograph?
Yes.
Dr. Cruz, I'm going to come back to that in just a second. As you go through and perform an autopsy and you find injuries, do you label them?
Yes.
And can you tell us why you're labeling them?
It's really to help me as I go back through my photographs. At times there are a significant number of injuries, and it can be difficult to tell which one is which in relation to my diagrams. So I label them really for organizational purposes.
And we kind of saw that photograph, but is that something that you did with this autopsy specifically?
Yes.
When you do your report of autopsy, is there a section in that report that you refer to as the evidence of injury section?
Yes.
And is that section labeled with letters?
Yes.
And do those letters correspond with the injuries that you find during your autopsy?
Yes.
And if you look up there, do you see State's Exhibit 115?
Yes.
And Dr. Cruz, is the document shown in Exhibit 115 the section evidence of injury from your report of autopsy?
Yes.
Is this a true and accurate copy of that section of your autopsy report?
Yes.
Your Honor, the State offers Exhibit 115 into evidence.
Mr. Speaks,
There's no objection, Your Honor.
Exhibit 115 is admitted.
Dr. Cruz, I'm going to go back to State's Exhibit 88. In this photograph, do you see injuries that you have labeled A, B, and C?
Yes.
And you are the person who put those labels on this photograph? Or,
I'm-
excuse me, not on the photograph, on the body?
I may have, or the autopsy tech may have done physically at my direction.
In the injury that would be labeled A, is that seen at the top portion of this photograph?
Yes.
And doctor, can you walk us through what your findings were for injury A?
This is classified as a stab wound of the neck. It specifically entered into the body on the left side of the neck. So as that stab wound entered the body, it passed through a number of muscles on the front of Mr. Bagley's neck. Then it also passed through part of Mr. Bagley's respiratory system, or his larynx, what you may call the windpipe, and then into the right side of his neck, where it injured one of the blood vessels in his neck.
And doctor, I'm going to come back to 88, but you referenced that this stab wound passed through the larynx, correct?
Yes.
And that was photographed as well, right?
Yes.
Looking at State's Exhibit 94, what are we seeing in this photograph?
So this is part of the internal portion of Mr. Bagley's neck. We're actually looking from the back side forward. At the top part, this is his tongue, and this is part of the upper airway. Here are his vocal cords, or his voice box, and this horizontal opening is that stab wound.
Can you describe for us, doctor, what your findings were related specifically to injury B?
Injury B was also classified as a stab wound. As a caveat, a stab wound goes into the body a longer distance than the defect or the wound that's on the surface of the skin. And that's in contrast to a cutting wound, which has a longer injury on the surface of the skin and isn't as deep. So injury B was also a stab wound. It also injured soft tissue like fat in the neck, and it went down and it injured part of his spinal column. It was the bony part of the spinal column where the neck meets the chest cavity.
And I'm just going to back up for 1 second, doctor, just to make sure that I understood what your explanation of stabbing versus cutting wounds were. Because you actually found stabbing and cutting wounds on this body, correct?
Correct.
And you said that a stab wound has to be deeper penetration into the body than the size of the surface injury.
Correct.
And then the cutting wound was, can you say the cutting wound one more time, please?
It's the opposite is true. So the size of the wound on the surface of the skin is longer than whatever distance it enters the body. Usually they're pretty superficial.
And a cutting wound doesn't necessarily require a knife, right?
Correct. Neither actually require a knife.
Your findings in regard to injury C on that photograph?
Injury C was a stab wound to the left shoulder, right here. And that actually only injured soft tissue like fat and muscle and did not injure any vital structures.
How do you designate vital structures versus soft tissue?
Really, vital structures are, without them, it would be very difficult to live, at least without really significant medical treatment. So an injury just to fat, just to muscle, potentially could cause death, but a good amount of time would likely have to go by for that to happen, versus injury to a vital structure causes death much more quickly.
And did you find vital structure injury in both A and B?
I did. B, injury to that spinal column is pretty significant injury. There are a lot of blood vessels around that bone, but there was not injury to the spinal cord itself, so it would not be essentially a rapidly fatal wound, but definitely a potentially fatal wound.
Doctor, looking now at State's Exhibit 89, is this labeled D?
Yes.
And can you tell us what portion of the body we're looking at in State's Exhibit 89, specifically D?
This is a photograph of Mr. Bagley's chest. His head would be in the lower portion of the photograph. And you can also see that tattoo on his chest that we had seen in his identification photograph.
Doctor, how did you describe or what findings did you make related to the injury observed in this photograph?
Stab wound D injured the muscle and the soft tissue of the chest and then penetrated the sternum or the chest plate. It did not go all the way through. It stopped at that bone.
Exhibit 90, injury listed as E. Doctor, can you tell us which part of the body is injured in this exhibit?
This is a photograph of the right side of his back. So now Mr. Bagley is placed so he's on his stomach. His right arm is in the bottom portion of the picture. This is his armpit area, and stab wound E is right here on the right side of his back.
And what specific findings did you make related to injury E?
Injury E was also a stab wound, and it again only injured soft tissue like fat and muscle of Mr. Bagley's back.
Moving on to Exhibit 91, Doctor, do we see multiple labeled injuries in this photograph?
Yes.
Starting with F, please. Firstly, can you tell us what part of the body we're viewing in this photograph?
In this photograph, Mr. Bagley is still on his stomach, and now we're on the left side of his back. Part of his left arm can be seen here in this corner of the picture, and this is his armpit area.
Can you tell us what your findings were related to injury F, Dr. Cruz?
Injury F is on this left side of the chest back region. Injury F went through soft tissue in between two ribs. It entered the left chest cavity. It injured the left lung. It then went through the pericardial sac, which is a membranous sac that surrounds the heart, and then it actually injured the heart itself.
Chest cavity. Can you explain to us what a cavity is?
Cavity is a space in your body. You really don't have too many. You have one in your head where your brain sits. You have cavities in your chest. The left side and the right side are pretty well separated. The left side, we think the heart, the left lung. The right side, you have a little bit of your heart and the right lung. Then you have your abdominal cavity with all different sorts of abdominal organs. And then we have a pelvic cavity where if you're a woman, it's a uterus. Man, your prostate would be there.
And when you describe puncturing a body cavity, is that significant?
Yes.
Can you tell us why?
In addition to having injury to that cavity and the organs in it, those cavities are closed spaces. They're closed off to the outside world by membranes. In the chest cavity, you have your pleura, which is a thin membrane that wraps around the cavity and actually covers the surface of the organs themselves. When you have any sort of injury to that chest cavity, you create a hole, and that hole introduces air into the cavity. Your body's natural defense is to try and close back up. So it will close up, that pleura will come back together, but then you have all this air in that cavity, and that makes it difficult for your lungs to expand, for you to breathe, for your heart to beat, and can be fatal if not treated.
Can you describe injury G for us, please?
Injury G is also a stab wound. Injury G also entered the left chest cavity through the soft tissue between two ribs. It also injured the left lung. Then it injured the diaphragm, which is muscle that separates that chest cavity from your abdominal cavity. Underneath your diaphragm on the left side is your stomach. So it also injured the stomach, and then it injured the spleen as well. This portion here of tissue is fat that came out of the wound during the process of the stabbing.
And you may have answered this, but I just want to make sure that this fat that you're referring to in injury G, is that how it appeared when you received it? That's not something that you removed to complete the autopsy?
Correct. It was just like this when he was received at our office.
And injury H, please.
Injury H also entered the left chest cavity. It injured the left lung, the diaphragm, the stomach, the spleen, and then it also injured small bowel, which is what you see here coming out of the wound.
And that was also out when you received Mr. Bagley?
Yes.
And what about K?
K is here on the lower left side of the back. That entered the abdominal cavity and injured the left kidney.
Doctor, when you perform autopsies, is part of the autopsy measuring those wounds?
Yes.
And can you tell us how deep are these wounds?
They varied in depth. They went up to 6 inches. And I say approximate depth. It can be difficult to measure, but in my opinion, up to 6 inches in depth.
Can you tell us why it's difficult to measure depth?
Skin, soft tissue, it's very pliable. So depending on how the body is laying, it takes different forms. You're laying on your back, you're laying on your front. You kind of get little variations in depth, not a lot, maybe 1/4 of an inch or so. Also, when you're dealing with a cavity that can kind of expand, contract, most people aren't laying down, just changes in shape slightly. So to be totally accurate, I say it's approximate.
Doctor, when you gave your grand jury testimony related to these injuries, you gave a description that was of a balloon?
Yes.
And can you explain for the jury that analogy used with the pushing of the balloon affecting the depth?
Yes. A balloon is a great way to describe that pleura that I talked about in the chest cavity. It's a thin membrane that completely encircles that cavity itself, and then all the organs are on the inside. So just like a balloon, that membrane is pliable, it moves with force. So say you have a balloon and you were to take your finger and push it, that balloon will move in with your finger. And the body is very similar. So if someone is taking a knife and stabbing you, your soft tissue in that chest cavity will actually move in the direction of that knife or that stabbing, and then it will bounce back to its original form after. That's why often when we do make approximate depth measurements, it tends to be longer than the instrument that was used to injure the person, because that cavity has bounced back and now we have a larger space than how the knife actually is.
Ms. Slaughter, we're going to need to take a break. Is this the time we can do that?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take an afternoon recess. We'll be in recess recess till 3:35. Remember your admonition during the recess.
All rise.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Cruz, before we took a break, we were looking at the injuries in Exhibit 91. Is there also an injury I?
Yes.
And can you show us where on this photo injury I should be?
Injury I is around here on the torso. It's located underneath this portion of small bowel that is protruding from wound H.
And so labeled and visible if the small bowel were lifted?
Yes.
Can you describe for us what injury and/or findings, you can leave those down, please, what injury or findings you had for injury I?
Injury I was also a stab wound. It entered the chest cavity and injured the diaphragm, but did not injure any other organs.
Dr. Cruz, there was testimony in this trial that when the defendant stabbed Chris Bagley the first time, that all the air left Chris Bagley's body.
I object, Your Honor. It's a misrepresentation of the testimony. I object.
Overruled.
Does that question, or excuse me, does that statement comport with or make sense to what your findings are of the injuries on this side of Mr. Bagley's abdomen area? That it looked like he deflated?
I suppose that could be the sort of response a person would have to stab wounds where, that knife entered the chest cavity.
Are the wounds, and there potentially could be a different answer for F, G, H, I, J, K, do you classify these injuries as serious injuries?
Yes.
Are they fatal?
We like to say, as forensic pathologists, all stab wounds are potentially fatal. You can have slow blood loss, infection later on. In terms of injuries that would be more immediately fatal, I would consider stab wound E to the neck, stab wound B also to the neck area, and then all the stab wounds on the left side, that F, G, H, and K.
Are you able, a wound or wounds like these, I'm specifically talking the ones on the side first, are those debilitating? Do you consider those debilitating injuries?
I know just from reviewing video and reading medical emergency medicine reports that everyone responds differently to injury, but I would think to most individuals these would be debilitating injuries.
What about A, B, and C? Same question regarding whether or not you would consider or form an opinion that those injuries would be debilitating.
A, B, and C. A, more so because of the injury to the respiratory system. I think that would be debilitating to anyone. B and C, where it's really soft tissue and some bone with B, potentially. Depends usually on the age of the individual, kind of other factors, but A, without a doubt.
Looking specifically at Exhibit 92, Dr. Cruz, can you tell us what we're seeing in this photograph?
This is a photograph of Mr. Bagley, again on his stomach. So we're looking at, this is his left thigh. His torso is up on the left side. His foot is down to the right side of the photograph. And this is L. It's a stab wound to the left thigh.
And what, if any, additional findings did you make about this injury?
This injury injured skin and soft tissue. And it had approximate depth of penetration of 1.5 inches.
And when, strike that, please. Dr. Cruz, would you consider this injury a serious injury, or is this more of a superficial injury?
It essentially is more of a superficial injury. There weren't any major blood vessels like the femoral artery injured, but it would definitely hurt.
When you examined this injury and compared to the other injuries that Mr. Bagley had on his body, was L consistent as far as size and shape of injury as the other injuries that you saw?
L was, in terms of the measurement of the wound on the surface of the skin, a little bit smaller than the other wounds in the torso and neck area, and it was shallower, but still considered a stab wound.
And looking at Exhibit 93, Dr. Cruz, can you tell us which part of the body we are looking at for these injuries?
This is Mr. Bagley's left lower extremity. This is his left knee, his left thigh, his left leg, and this is his calf area because he is again still lying on his stomach.
And in this photograph, are we seeing injuries that you have labeled M, N, O, and P?
Yes.
And can you describe for us what conclusions, if any, you drew related specifically to injury M?
M was considered a cutting wound because the measurement of the wound on the surface of the skin was longer than its depth of penetration.
And what about N?
N was the same. It was also a cutting wound.
Can you point specifically at the injury on the photo that you have marked as N?
N is this one right here. It's quite small.
And O is which one?
O is this more vertical wound right here next to N.
And did you also categorize N and O as cutting wounds?
Yes.
Is P also categorized as a cutting wound?
P was categorized as a stab wound.
Doctor, when you are looking at these type of injuries, are you able to make any determinations about what you believe caused injuries? And that's just in general. When you look at something as part of your job to determine if certain instruments are consistent with the injuries that you're viewing.
Could you rephrase that?
Yes. When you're reviewing a body and you look at injuries, do you ever compare injuries to instruments that could have caused those injuries?
Yes.
Is that an exact science?
No.
In this case, were you given 2 knives to compare to the injuries that you saw on this body?
Yes.
And when you looked at those knives, just to be clear, you weren't able to draw any specific conclusions, right, as far as definite answers?
Correct.
Okay. The type of knives Dr. Cruz, I'm going to pull up what's already been admitted as State's Exhibit 36 and 37. Dr. Cruz, is this one of the knives that you compared to the injuries?
Yes.
And 37, did you also look at this knife when comparing to the injuries?
Yes.
Can you tell us what, if any, conclusions, opinions that you drew when you compared those knives to the injuries that were sustained by Mr. Bagley?
As we stated, it's nearly impossible, especially with stab wounds, to say a particular knife caused a wound, since knives are incredibly similar. But comparing the wounds on Mr. Bagley and looking at the ends of many of the wounds, many of them had what we call a sharp end, where both sides of the wound come together. And the other end, we had a blunt end. When I push both sides of the skin together, there's a little gap, meaning that potentially there's a squared off end with that knife. Both knives showed the potential to cause those types of wounds, so it's possible they could have.
Can you just show me, I'm looking at 36 right now, Doctor. When you say both knives had the potential to cause those types of wounds, what part of this knife would cause an injury similar to that?
So what we have, you usually have at least one sharp end, and that's the cutting end of the knife. But then the other side of the wound is the opposite part of the knife right here. So part of this is blunted, so it potentially could have caused a blunt end. But thinking about the wounds on the body, the knife doesn't necessarily enter all the way. So you could think it could have potentially two sharp ends, a blunt and a sharp end, depending on how far the knife entered the body.
Did you make any other conclusions or form any other opinions regarding the knife and the injuries that you saw?
Not that I recall.
Dr. Cruz, you testified that Mr. Bagley was dressed when you received his body, and that part of your job in performing an autopsy would be undressing and, in this case, documenting the clothing, correct?
Correct.
I'm going to show you States 95. Can you tell us, Dr. Cruz, what item of clothing are we looking at in 95?
This is a t-shirt Mr. Bagley was wearing.
And what specifically in this t-shirt were you attempting to document with this photograph?
We were attempting to show in the photograph these number of linear defects in the t-shirt that corresponded to the stab wounds on his body.
And when you say defects, can you tell us what you mean by defects?
They're slit-like openings in the shirt.
And in 96, are these the pants that Mr. Bagley had on?
Yes.
Was there anything specific seen in 96 that you would have considered a defect?
Here, these number of little slit-like openings on this pant leg, in comparison to the defects in the shirt, these aren't as obvious as stab wound type defects, but again, they're irregularities or openings in the pants.
In 97, what are we looking at here?
This is a red bandana that was encircling Mr. Bagley's neck at the time of autopsy.
And do you see defects in the bandana as well?
Yes, there are a number of slit-like defects throughout the bandana.
Doctor, what are we looking at in Exhibit 98?
This is something that I classified as a fanny pack that was encircling Mr. Bagley's waist at the time of autopsy. There are 2 clips at the ends, and this is a very narrow zippered pouch.
Dr. Cruz, were there, specifically I'm going to talk about the shirt first, were there injuries on the body? I know you said that correlated with the wounds that you saw on the shirt.
Yes.
Were there more holes on the shirt than you were able to find injuries on Mr. Bagley's body?
Yes.
Same question related to the bandana. Were there holes on the bandana that correlated with the injuries to where you found the bandana being worn on Mr. Bagley's body?
Yes.
And were there more holes in the bandana than injuries to Mr. Bagley?
Yes.
And Dr. Cruz, if you had those items of clothing in front of you, would it help you explain how that could be?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, I need to have the 3 of you sitting in the front. Move over this way. We're going to bring something in. I don't want to bring it right next to you. They're going to just roll all the way down here. Slaughter?
I am, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Dr. Cruz, the T-shirt that you see on display, is that the T-shirt that Mr. Bagley was wearing during the autopsy or at the time that his body was exhumed?
Yes.
And same questions as far as the bandana. Is that the same bandana that Mr. Bagley was wearing at the time the autopsy was performed and that he was exhumed?
Yes.
And this, your words, fanny pack that's around the waist, is that also the fanny pack that you took off the body of Christopher Bagley?
Yes.
Your Honor, the state would move to have exhibits 106, 107, and 108 admitted into evidence.
Can I have counsel approach briefly? I'm going to defer admission of the documents. We are going to treat them as a demonstrative for you to look at now. And if I admit them, I'll advise you later on whether there's something that I would actually send back to the jury room or not, okay? Go ahead, Ms. Slaughter.
Excuse me, Your Honor, you haven't asked my position on the...
Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Spees, would you object to admission, assuming we can address the issue we talked about at sidebar?
If I could just briefly watch the witness, Your Honor.
Certainly.
Dr. Cruz, good afternoon.
Afternoon.
On the exhibits that are shown before us this afternoon, was the fanny pack underneath the shirt when you examined the body?
If I remember correctly, yes.
Okay. Thank you. That's all the questions I have about here.
Mr. Spees, any objection, assuming we address the handling issue?
No.
All right, so if we could sort out how we'll package them up so that they can be safely handled, then I'll admit them. Otherwise, we'll treat them as a demonstrative, which allows you to proceed right now.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Cruz, in how the clothes are displayed on the mannequin in front of us, is there anything that you would change about how they're displayed based on how you received the body?
Well, for one, if I remember correctly, the fanny pack was underneath the shirt, and the red bandana was rolled up around his neck.
Would you be able to show us would you be able to put it back in the position that you found it in?
Sure.
Do you have gloves?
Yep.
Judge, she has what kind too? Sorry? She has mic that kind too?
Bandana is hard because strippers dried blood. It was more rolled up around him, and then the shirt was on the outside.
Doctor, while you're up there, how does the way the bandana was rolled affect the amount of defects that you see in the bandana?
With the bandana rolled up, a single stab wound would produce multiple defects in the bandana.
And on the t-shirt specifically, same question regarding the number of holes that you see specifically on the left torso abdomen area. Can you explain to us how there would come to be more holes than injuries in that area of the body?
It's a similar concept where the fabric, if it's folded over, a single stab would produce multiple defects.
When you look at the t-shirt, are the holes on the t-shirt lower on this mannequin than they were on Chris?
Yes, I
If there was a struggle going on at the time of the stabbing, would that make the defects on the shirt comport with the injuries to the body?
Yes, if there's a struggle, the shirt would move and then potentially move so it lines up more so with the stab wound.
Is there a hole on the shirt, top left shoulder area?
Yes.
And can you turn that in a way where that's visible to the jury? Thank you. Doctor, if you, in your opinion, can you tell us which injury on Mr. Bagley that defect in the shirt associated with?
It likely matches up with stab wound C, which was on the left shoulder. There were no other wounds in that area.
And the holes on the bandana, did those, in your opinion, doctor, match up with the injuries that you saw in A, B, and C around the neck?
Because it was so rolled up, I wasn't able to match them specifically to each one, but it correlated with the fact that he had wounds to his neck and there were defects in the bandana.
And the bandana was being worn around the neck at the time that he died?
Yes.
Thank you, doctor. Doctor, when you examined and did the autopsy, can you tell us if you noted during your autopsy any injuries to Mr. Bagley's hands?
I did not see any injuries to his hands.
And can you tell us if that was significant in any way to you?
Hand injuries, especially in cases of a stabbing, are commonly referred to as defensive type wounds. So it just indicated he didn't have any.
Did you find anywhere on his body during the autopsy anything that you would have classified as a defensive wound?
No.
And Dr. Cruz, the injuries to the legs, specifically the ones you referred to as cutting injuries, I believe, without going back and pulling that picture up again, that it was M, N, O, and P. Do those type of injuries, and I think you may have answered this, but they did not have to be caused by a knife, is that correct?
Correct.
Are they consistent with, or could they have been consistent with, injuries sustained while Mr. Bagley's body was being dragged through a trailer?
Yes.
Could injuries like that have occurred while he was being fed out of a window?
If there was, say, broken glass, yes.
So essentially, if the legs dropped and hit something sharp, it could have caused those type of injuries.
Yes.
Similarly to it being in the back of a pickup truck or being buried even.
Yes.
Were you able, Dr. Cruz, to determine, are you able to determine at all injuries that are caused when someone is alive versus injuries when someone is deceased?
Yes.
And how do you go about doing that?
The difference between the two is hemorrhage or bleeding, either into soft tissue or into a cavity. Your heart is pumping when you're still alive or in the process of dying, so you should have hemorrhage or blood in the area of that wound. If someone is already deceased, then they will not have hemorrhage.
Specifically related to the wounds that you classified as being stabbing wounds in the torso area of the left side, are you able in any way to determine if Mr. Bagley was alive for each one of those stab wounds?
They all did appear to have hemorrhage associated with them. It was difficult because he had been dead for a period of time, and he also had hemorrhage in his chest cavity. So I think it was likely that he was alive or in the process of dying when he sustained those wounds.
And do you have the same opinion of the injuries that were to the upper throat, neck area?
Yes, he also appeared to have hemorrhage associated with those wounds.
What about the injuries associated on the lower extremities in the later parts of the alphabet?
Those did not have the same appearance as the other wounds. There wasn't any real appreciable hemorrhage. Doesn't mean it wasn't there, when he sustained the injuries, but it was not there at autopsy.
And when you say doesn't mean, is that because the distance or the amount of time that lapsed between the injuries and the finding of the body?
Yes, and the fact that he was in a wet environment, wet ground, the water will leach out that blood, so the wound does not appear hemorrhagic. Appear what? Hemorrhagic.
Is there any way, doctor, to determine which one of these stabbing wounds was the fatal injury?
No.
And other than the two, I believe, that you referenced as being injuries to soft tissue opposed to, could any of those other wounds have killed Mr. Bagley?
Yes.
Were you able to make any determination regarding angles of wounds or we'll start with angles. What angles they came from?
We do, or I did at autopsy. I determined the direction of the wound path solely as it was inside of the body.
And can you explain, specifically related to, I'm referring to them as the neck injuries, A, B, and C, what direction and what your findings regarding direction were for that?
For A, the one that was near the front of his neck, the direction, and this is in terms of what we call anatomic position, that's a person standing straight up, looking straight ahead, their arms by their sides and their palms facing forward. So the direction in terms of that type of position was front to back, left to right, and slightly upward. That was for A. For B, the direction was front to back, left to right, and downward. And for C, the one on the shoulder, the direction was back to front, left to right, and downward.
Doctor, specifically in related to A, and you said that one was upward, correct?
Yes.
And you described this anatomical position as being straight ahead, straight up and down.
Correct.
If someone's head, specifically Mr. Bagley's in this case, was pulled backwards, would that change the direction from downward to upward if the neck was exposed in that direction?
If it was pulled backward, it's possible, more so maybe backward and left to right sort of flexion of the neck, I think would change the upward and downward angle more. But really, in my report, I said slightly upward, so I think any sort of change would have made it possibly downward versus upward.
Without you knowing the exact position of a body at the time that an injury has occurred, are you able to, other than saying something is consistent with, are you able to definitively say what shape or position someone was in at the time something happened?
No.
And I ask that because we live in a day of, you know, all the TV shows where they've always got trajectory and all of the above. Are you able to say specifically how the knife in any one of these injuries entered that body, or what position somebody's body was in when it happened?
No, I can't say.
Dr. Cruz, you also testified early on that as one of your tasks and duties in performing an autopsy is removing fluids from the body so that they can be tested, and you said toxicology, correct?
Correct.
Did you do toxicology on Mr. Bagley?
Yes.
Were there lots of substances found in his system?
There were a number of substances found.
Can you tell us what those were?
So in terms of what we tested blood from the sac around his heart because he had injury to the heart itself. We would consider that blood, heart blood that was in his heart. He had caffeine, he had nicotine, he had cotinine, which is a breakdown product of nicotine. He had methamphetamine, and he had amphetamine, which is a breakdown product of methamphetamine.
When you receive and see levels in a toxicology report like that, are you able to determine if that's a high level, a normal level? Do you make any determinations like that?
We do. It's person dependent, so I may use it more so if I think it caused a person's death.
Did you make any, did you have an opinion about his levels as far as high, medium, low, anything like that?
I personally did not.
Was there anything in your autopsy or findings that you made that led you to believe that any of the intoxicants or substances that you found in Mr. Bagley's blood had any contributing factors to his death?
No.
And did you make a determination as to what his cause of death was?
Yes.
And what was that determination?
Multiple sharp force injuries.
And you say sharp force injuries. Are there more than one type of force injuries?
Yes. Classically, we talk of two, sharp force versus blunt force. Sharp force, commonly think of a knife. It cuts and divides tissue as it comes into contact with the body, and that is in contrast to a blunt force injury where impact from that object crushes and tears tissue upon impact.
And earlier, Dr. Cruz, I also asked you about Mr. Bagley's height. I believe you said he was approximately 5'9". Can you recall what his weight was?
His weight was 170 pounds.
Could the weight, being buried for 2+ months, does that affect weight at all?
Decomposition that occurs can potentially affect weight. It usually lowers a person's weight as tissue breaks down.
Did you find in this autopsy enough decomposition to have made any significant change in weight from what you weighed him to be when you did the autopsy?
I think it's possible, but not a considerable amount of difference.
Okay, we're not talking 50 pounds here.
Correct.
Okay. I don't have any further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Spees, you can start your cross-exam.
I do, and I have no use for the mannequin, so I'd ask that it be removed.
Can we roll that out? You can either roll out of the way or just stand up. I don't want her to roll real close to you, so come over towards me here. Thank you. Mr. Spies.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
Doctor, I'd like to turn just briefly to the wounds you described for us this afternoon, and PE. These were the injuries found to Mr. Bagley's left lower extremity. And these were different both in appearance and nature than the other injuries you described for us this afternoon, right?
Correct.
And among the differences were that they were smaller and they didn't have any hemorrhaging in them, right?
Correct.
And you explained that absence of hemorrhaging could have been due to the blood from the wounds leaching out during the time that the body was on the ground.
Correct.
Could have also been, Doctor, that those injuries were inflicted during the course of removing the body from the ground.
Correct.
So despite the best care that your forensic anthropologist took and that the other members of the team took in extracting Mr. Bagley's body from the ground, it could have been an injury from a trowel or from a shovel or from a knife.
It's possible. I don't think it was likely due to the positioning of his body, but it is within the realm of possibility.
As a matter of fact, when you testified before the men and women of the grand jury in this case, you said that those injuries could have occurred after death,
Yes,
including the man who was described.
correct.
Okay. Next, I'd like to speak with you about the toxicology report that that accompanied your post-mortem findings in your autopsy report. And if you could reach to the small black lighter on the table there that says defendant's exhibits, and turn to exhibit F as in Frank, for us, please. Got that before you?
Yes.
And after you looked at it, tell the men and women of the jury what defendant's exhibit F is.
It's the toxicology report from the defendant's blood.
So
I'm
just-
sorry, the decedent's blood.
And it looks like this report was done outside the state medical examiner's office.
Correct.
So you would have farmed out or shipped out the blood and other bodily fluids for analysis by a toxicology lab.
Correct.
And could you tell the men and women of the jury whether defendant's exhibit F would have accompanied your autopsy report or been a supplement to your autopsy report?
Yes, it's included at the end of the autopsy report.
Okay. And this is one of the records that you would have kept in the ordinary course of the state medical examiner's business here in Lincoln, Iowa.
Yes.
All right. We offer defendant's exhibit F.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Exhibit F is admitted.
And now you told the men and women of the jury and us this afternoon that in the toxicology findings you detected in Mr. Bagley's blood nicotine, smoking or chewing tobacco, caffeine, coffee or some other caffeine products, and both amphetamine and methamphetamine. You told us that the amphetamine is a byproduct of methamphetamine. Could you just explain to us briefly how that happens?
When you take most drugs or medications, your body has to break it down in order to use it and excrete it. Amphetamine is one of those breakdown products of what we call the parent compound, methamphetamine. During that process, there are some compounds that we call inactive. They don't mean anything to your body. And then we have breakdown products that are active, meaning they actually cause their own effects on the body. Amphetamine is one of those.
Okay, and I know that among the 1,000+ autopsies that you perform, including auto accidents, drug overdoses, and so I'd like to ask you some questions specifically about some of the toxicology findings in your case, okay?
Okay.
And we're going to call up defendant's exhibit F, and if we may display that to the jury.
You may.
Okay, we have up on the screen here, Doctor, the face page of defendant's exhibit F, and I'd like to focus in specifically on the findings in the box that's kind of at the center. We'll zoom that up for you. And this, I think, corresponds to what you told us earlier about the substances you found in Mr. Bagley's heart blood. And turning to the findings of methamphetamine. Could you tell the men and women of the jury the significance of the results of the testing for methamphetamine?
It was positive for methamphetamine. The concentration or amount in his system was 3,600 nanograms per milliliter of whole blood.
And tell us what that means. And by that, I mean the 3,600 nanograms per milliliter.
It's that much drug to a milliliter of blood.
And based on your study and your training in forensic science, and I'm sure you've taken a course in forensic toxicology as well, what is the significance of that level of methamphetamine in blood?
While everyone is different, it was likely exerting some sort of effect on Mr. Bagley.
As a matter of fact, on page 3 of Defendant's Exhibit F is a table or an explanation about methamphetamine found in pericardial blood. And tell us what pericardial blood is.
Pericardial blood is that pericardial sac around the heart. Within that sac, you shouldn't have blood, but because he had injury to his heart, there was blood in there.
And is that where you got the blood that was used for the toxicology analysis here?
Yes.
Okay. And in the second paragraph of paragraph 8, it says that a peak blood concentration of methamphetamine of 20 nanograms per milliliter was reported at 2.5 hours after an oral dosage. And it also says blood levels of 200 to 600 nanograms per milliliter have been reported in methamphetamine abusers who exhibited violent and irrational behavior.
Correct.
Would you agree with that summary of the significance of that level of methamphetamine?
I do use those levels throughout my career, just when I look at cases, so it seems appropriate.
So 3,600 nanograms per milliliter is a lot more than 200 to 600.
Yes.
Like multiples of many.
Yes.
In addition, I know, we'll take that down, thank you. In addition, I know that you've studied probably about the phenomenon of physical activity before collapse in cases where people sustain a fatal injury. Do you know what I'm saying?
I've had cases where people were exercising, or I guess maybe rephrase that.
Yeah. So, for example, somebody who suffers a serious gunshot wound and can run down the street before they collapse. You've read about that.
Yes, and I've seen it.
And you've seen it?
Yes.
Okay. So, I guess what I'm driving at is that even though Mr. Bagley has sustained a series of serious stab wounds, he could still be exhibiting physical activity.
With the injuries to his chest, yes, I think so.
Okay. And if involved in a violent physical encounter, he may not, given that level of methamphetamine, been cognizant of how seriously he was hurt.
I suppose it's possible, yes.
Or the level of methamphetamine in his system could have increased his ability to continue to actively fight, participate before collapse.
Possible.
I wanted to ask you next a couple of questions about the knife wounds, or the stab wounds that you observed. And you were asked whether any of the stab wounds that you observed on Mr. Bagley's body could have been inflicted by the knife that you were shown, I think, exhibit number 36. Recall that?
I don't remember the exact number, but yes, the knives that were shown.
And there was something distinctive about the blade that you were shown. Not only did it have a sharp cutting edge, but it also had a serrated edge or a hook on one edge. In your examination of knife wounds in your career, have you noticed that serrated edges created a distinct, or can create a distinct pattern on an edge of a wound?
Not usually on stab wounds, but if the knife were more at an angle, like drug across the skin, then yes.
Yeah, so for example, if the knife was withdrawn with pressure on the serrated edge, it may have created a jagged edge in the wound.
If the knife were moving, An in and an out, at least in my experience, usually causes just a similar wound to a non-serrated knife. But if it were an at an angle, yes.
And particularly a knife that has a big hook on one edge, on one side of it, that hook could create a distinct pattern as well.
It could.
Did you observe any of those sorts of features in the knife wounds that you saw in Mr. Bagley's mind?
No.
Counsel, could I have you both approach briefly? We think we're fairly close to being able to wrap up, but I promised you if we were going to go past 4:30, I would give you the chance to tell me that that's an issue. I would tell you that the doctor would have to drive quite a ways to come back tomorrow. She could if we needed to do that. Is there anybody that needs to wrap up right at 4:30, or if we go till sometime between now and 5? Can everybody make that work? Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Speed.
Thank you. I will be brief. I'm sure you've heard that before. Doctor, we're not going to ask you to take a look in the defense exhibit finder at defendant's exhibit J, like John.
Yes.
Do you have that in front of you?
Yes.
And tell us what exhibit J shows.
It's a photograph of that clothing item that I called a fanny pack.
Okay. And does this accurately demonstrate, I think what you've already told us about the fanny pack that you removed from Mr. Bagley's body?
Yes.
We all have this exhibit J.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Exhibit J is admitted.
If we could display that for the jury, please. The defendant's exhibit J is what you said it was removed from Mr. Bagley's body, and did the belting have a knot in it?
I don't quite recall at autopsy.
Okay, I was wondering if that was a knot or if it was a separate part of the strap. You see what I mean by the top, like a 12 o'clock?
I do. It seems to be something that would adjust it.
Okay. There we go.
Yes.
All right. And next I'd like to have you take a look at defendant's exhibit K.
Yes.
And tell us what exhibit K is.
It's the photograph of Mr. Bagley that we had seen where it's almost as we received him. However, the tarp and blanket or sheet that were covering him, it opened up so you could see him better.
All right. And does this show the fanny pack around Mr. Bagley's waist, as it would have been underneath the T-shirt?
Yes.
Okay. We offer defendant's exhibit K.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Exhibit K is admitted.
And we also display exhibit K.
You may do so.
Okay. And again, the body is shown here. Before you begin your anatomic examination of Mr. Bagley's body, and the fanny pack is visible there against the skin underneath the shirt.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Cruz, thank you for your time with us this afternoon. I have no other questions.
Thank you.
Ms. Slaughter, do you have a redirect?
Brief, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Dr. Cruz, like with any other drug, and people build up a tolerance to it,
Yes.
alcohol.
Yes.
So methamphetamine too, the more someone uses it, potentially the more their body becomes tolerant.
Yes.
And is there any way for you to know specifically what effects that level of drug would have on anybody's person?
No.
Fentanyl would have the opposite effect of methamphetamine, is that true?
Yes, it's a depressant versus a stimulant.
And so are you able to make any conclusive determinations on someone's potential behavior when they've got uppers and downers and a little bit of everything else in their blood?
I have no idea how it affects the person.
Especially when you don't know what their regular pattern of use is?
Exactly.
I don't have anything further, Your Honor.
Mr. Spees, any recross?
Just briefly, Doctor, you've seen instances where people have had fatal overdoses of methamphetamine with that level of methamphetamine in their system, haven't you?
Yes.
Thank you. Anything further, Ms. Slaughter?
No, Your Honor.
All right, doctor, you're excused. You may step down. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now in a position to recess, so we didn't keep you very long past 4:30. Remember your admonition. We will reconvene at 9 a.m. tomorrow.